Hey, Christy, how are you today? Here we are again for another episode of All's Authors Untangling Alzheimer's and Dementia podcast.
Hi, Marianne. I'm great, and I'm very excited for this episode. I'm excited to talk to our author, Daniel Gibbs, who I just find him so charming and wonderful, and we'll hear his story. It's great. So I'm really excited to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, Dan is a wonderful man. He's a retired neurologist, so he has the benefit of not only having a lot of knowledge about the anatomy of the brain and physiology and the disease process of the Alzheimer's and the other dementias, but he also is living with the disease himself. So he kind of sees everything from both sides. And I think he has a lot of good information to share with the listeners. I think that the people in our organization, the ones who are living with dementia, are some of the best that we have because they are so willing to share their stories and to teach us things that we really need to know as caregivers and people concerned about other people with dementia. We just can't get that from anywhere else for them to share their stories and what's going on in their heads and how they manage and how they cope and the different symptomology. We have very few, maybe we have about 10 people like that in all of All's Authors, but we are so grateful to them for sharing their stories. So Dan came to us a couple of years ago with his first book, which was called A Tattoo on My Brain. And the new book we're talking about today is called Dispatches from the Land of Alzheimer's, which is a series of short essays and vignettes that he's written over the last few years about his life with dementia that I think people will find illuminating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you. I feel like our authors that are living with dementia are so generous with their time and they're sharing vulnerabilities that most of us might want to hide from but they're willing to share them because they really want to, as we say, light the way for others. So it's just so it's incredible, and I respect them and appreciate them so much. And he's so charming, so it'll be really fun to talk with him and hear more.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot about something we talk about at All's Authors, the power of vulnerability in like peeling back the layers and revealing your true self to others so that you can help them. And whether you're a caregiver writing about your own journey or sharing your story with someone, you don't even have to write it. You could just talk about it. And especially if you have dementia, to reveal that about yourself and to be open and honest about it. It's a vulnerability that once shared becomes very powerful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'm excited. So let's jump into the episode.
Okay.
Well, hi, Dan. It's so nice to see you and welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
Great. And hi, Marianne. Great to have you on here with us too. And we're excited here to have you again and hear about your new book. So maybe we can start by you telling us a little bit about what's going on for you these days and how you came to write this new book and how it's going. So we'll just start with that.
Yeah. So this book is quite a bit different than the first book that I wrote, A Tattoo on My Brain, which I'd actually recommend that people read that one first rather than the second one, because the second one is a collection of essays that I've written over the last 2 or 3 years. And so they don't make a smooth message, but each essay, I hope, has a nugget that will resonate to varying degrees with people. Some of them are as non-Alzheimer's as talking about the Columbia River, which is one of my favorite places in the world, particularly Beacon Rock. But others are my take at the time on recent advances in Alzheimer's research. And I tried to write them to be accessible to lay readers, and kind of translating the scientific gibberish at times into something that someone who is not a scientist or a medical doctor would be able to understand. And I've lost the train of thought there. Where are you going?
Well, you were talking about your new book, but and you just mentioned you tried to write it in layman's terms so that people could understand. And I want to say thank you for that as someone who's not a medical scientist. So thank you for that. But We were talking about how it's different from your previous book. It's the different types of essays that may be Alzheimer's related or not. So
That's right. And there's some that are much more family related. Like I have an essay about my dad and how he likely had hoarding disorder, which, to bring that into the overall tent of Alzheimer's, is becoming an area of some interest. That people who have hoarding disorder seem to have a greater propensity for later developing Alzheimer's disease, but not all of them, obviously. But my dad was a collector, and we all thought it was pretty funny. I don't think my mom didn't think it was funny. When he died, she just called the garbage man in to come and get rid of all that stuff. But he had an office building where he did his tinkering with electronic stuff, and he was a constant customer of the nearby rescue mission that collected junk, and so he traded junk with them. And he had something like 10 garages out in the back that were full of stuff like dishwashers that didn't work, and this sort of stuff that I thought were great, because I would go over there and play while he was doing something, and always find something interesting to some old television set, or some meters, or so it was a great place to be a young kid. But probably he was a difficult husband in that regard for my mother.
So that would be very interesting to hear how that's connected to dementia, Alzheimer's. And yeah, that's interesting.
My father didn't live long enough to find out if he was going to get dementia, because he died of cancer when he was 60.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
He probably would have gotten Alzheimer's if he lived longer.
I love that chapter about your father and the hoarding.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I like about the book. It is written in layman's terms, like you say, but a little bit, on the scientific edge to really give people an understanding of like just the neurology and the anatomy of the brain and things like that, which I haven't seen in a lot of the books that we have in the collection. So the fact that you wrote it, coming from both perspectives as a neurologist, a physician, and then as a person living with Alzheimer's, it offers the reader so much insight into how the disease process works and how you live with it. A lot of people will really like, and the little chapters are so short, they're 3-4 pages, and you can read and digest it, and then at the end you have left resources so people can delve into it a little more deeply if they want to. And the chapter about your father, that was really heartwarming. And that's what I think people want, is they want stories and they want to hear about real people.
Yeah. And what I've always tried to avoid is the doom and gloom of Alzheimer's. And because we know about that. But the messages that I want to get across are, how do you live with the disease? And what can you do to slow it down? And, I discussed that in both books, but in the lifestyle changes that can, with basis, make the disease progress more slowly. And I think that's an important message to get across.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you then, as a person living with dementia, what have you learned now that you wish you knew when you were practicing?
Well, when I was practicing, I knew virtually nothing about Alzheimer's. So, I finished my neurology residency in '89 and joined a large group practice of neurologists. And at that time, I would say that dementia was probably my least favorite thing to manage, because there was absolutely nothing. It didn't seem to be anything that we could do. And back then, the standard of care, which definitely was wrong, but was ignore it. It tried to tell people tried to reassure people that, oh, this is probably not dementia. You're just worried, or you're nervous, or, whatever. And that changed in the 1990s when Aricept came out. And that was the first time that we had a medication that actually did do something for Alzheimer's disease. And one thing I've learned is that those drugs, like Aricept, are actually more effective than we thought. When I was using it for people, I would describe it, a few people would have remarkable improvement. And so I kind of thought, well, that's, what to expect. But most people either remained the same or continued to decline. And I realize now that I was using the wrong metric. I was, and I was not alone. We were trying to, neurologists were trying to do something that would improve cognition. Well, those drugs like Aricept rarely do that. But what they do, very clearly do, is slow the decline, the cognitive decline. And that's something that I don't think that's really recognized, that I've become an advocate for pushing the Aricept-like drugs. And that can be hard because they have a lot of side effects, and it involves starting at very low doses and gradually increasing it, not giving up too early, because they do make a difference. And according to one paper, which I think I mentioned in the book, this slow and decline is about the same as with the new drugs. At least aducanumab and donanemab is probably going to be better, but there's no reason to not at least give the Aricept drugs a try.
Yeah.
Provided that you have Alzheimer's. And then that's another thing that's become important, is making the proper diagnosis and, sorting out the different types of dementia, and realizing, from the neurologist's point of view, that it is very common, almost the rule, to have mixed dementias, particularly the combination of Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. Almost everybody who's got Alzheimer's changes in their brain also has signs of vascular dementia and vice versa. But even the Lewy body dementia that we think of more aligned to Parkinson's disease, that often is found in people with Alzheimer's dementia as well. So it's a complicated mishmash, but making a proper diagnosis is key to knowing whether medications may be beneficial.
And I think what you're saying is so great for people to hear, is that we all want that miracle cure, right? That's going to, you take this pill and then we're going to get it all back. We're going to get all that memory back. We're going to get all that cognitive distortion back and everything. We're going to be fine. We're going to reverse what happened. And what you're saying is it's slowing the progression, which is in and of itself pretty miraculous, given what we know about how the disease has progressed throughout the ages and that we know of. And so it's like looking at it through a different lens. And what's the metric? What is it we're really able to do here?
And the other thing is that it could be, and I think it's likely, that it'll turn out that the best time for treating Alzheimer's disease is before there are any symptoms. And that's a little bit controversial, but there are trials of all of these drugs now, donanemab. I don't think there may still be a trial of aducanumab in the asymptomatic stage. I'm not sure. But these trials are for people who have the neuropathological changes in their brain of Alzheimer's because they came from a family history or whatever, but have no symptoms of cognitive decline. And so they're being given the drug to see, or placebo, to see if it benefits more to stop the disease before it gets going. And that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch.
I'm fascinated hearing you say this, because my mother had Alzheimer's and she did take Aricept. Now, she actually died from cancer, but so she was in very early stages. She died at age 83, but it was a recurrence of some cancer is what took her life. So, I mean, this is fascinating to me. It's like, well, what do I need to do? And I pay attention to lifestyle, right? So I know I have this genetic history, but I have also the opportunity so my father had vascular dementia. And I'm pretty sure that's because he just was not a great eater. he was a type A meat and potatoes guy.
Let me throw in a challenge to you. You are exactly the sort of person that research studies are looking for.
Wow. Where do I sign up, Daniel? I need to find a place.
Because there are more and more trials now of people who have the genetic predisposition for it, who are then tested like with a PET scan. And if they do have the amyloid there, then they're fodder for trials. And all my children are interested in it. So I'm a homozygous. I have 2 copies of the
Mm,
APOE4.
hmm.
So that means that all of my children have at least one.
Yeah.
And so they're aware of their risk and they're interested in getting involved when they get a little older.
Well, maybe we'll have to talk offline and you'll tell me where I can go and sign up because whatever I can do for research and for my own well-being.
Well,
But that's
let me
fascinating to hear. Yeah.
let me just mention, because I try to mention this every time I talk to people,
Hmm.
uh, there are several good resources for finding trials that fit you and are in your region or accessible or whatever. And one is Trial Match, which is a website run by the Alzheimer's Association.
Oh,
And it's very easy to use. You just type in where you live and whatnot, and it gives you a list of trials that are within a certain of your home. Now, sometimes it's kind of weak because there may not be that many.
hmm.
And so the one that is the best, but also much more complicated to use is, it's the NIH one. I'm blocking on it.
Well, it
I
may
want to,
come to you. So it's an
yeah, okay,
NHI one. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating.
the one I'm thinking of
Yeah.
has every single trial that is registered with the government, regardless of where it is. And so sometimes it just is overwhelming, the number
Yeah.
of ones there. You have to be careful in what you're looking for.
And I know our listeners and our people who follow us are also interested in this because anybody who's caring for someone, if you have any genetic relationship to that person, it inevitably comes to your mind.
So, Dan, when your first inkling or symptom that something was awry and was the fact that you lost your sense of smell, and in the book you wrote about COVID and the connections between Alzheimer's and that loss of sense of smell. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, they are two different ways of having smell affected. And it's people who are going to get Alzheimer's will still lose their sense of smell from COVID. But the difference is that it almost always comes back with COVID. And it comes on suddenly with COVID. Usually people lose their sense of smell over the course of a couple of days, and then it comes back over weeks to months. With Alzheimer's, it's more insidious. It starts so gradually that the majority of people with Alzheimer's are unaware that they have impairment of their smell. It just kind of creeps up on you. And the only reason I was alerted to it was because I had a rare condition of having hallucinatory smells called phantasmias. And they're much more common in Parkinson's disease, but they can be seen in Alzheimer's as well. And so that was clearly normal. They're just out of the blue, I would get this smell of baking bread mixed with perfume and lasting 2, 3, 4 minutes. So that was when I started testing my own sense of smell. And from the get-go, I was down in the first time I measured it, I was in the 30th percentile for my ability to discriminate odors. And as time went on, over the next 3 or 4 years, my smell was gone completely. But if you ask people with Alzheimer's, even, mild, or you rarely get a positive response that, unless, you know, all of a sudden they say, I don't smell dog poop anymore. And that's one thing that I realized pretty quickly. I don't smell skunks, it's very obvious now, but it doesn't bother me. When I started having the phantasmias in, I think, 2006, I had no cognitive impairment. I was still practicing, teaching, and I had no thought of Alzheimer's disease because both of my parents died early. And it wasn't until I inadvertently found out that I had the ApoE4 alleles, both of them positive, that it slipped into the possibility, that I was at risk for Alzheimer's. And even then, I had no cognitive impairment. But I realized having 2 copies, I had an enormous, almost certain chance of having Alzheimer's by age 80. And I was late 60s at that time. So I did retire in 2013 just because, even though I didn't have any cognitive problems, as a doctor, I just couldn't run the risk of screwing up. And if I'd been in almost any other profession, I think I could have worked for a few more years, but it wouldn't have been safe. it wasn't until 2015 that I really got a diagnosis, based on PET scans as part of a study. And I was just starting to get some very mild cognitive impairment by 2015. So, the loss of smell came way before. Now, it's very non-specific because you can lose your sense of smell from a lot of things. So it doesn't mean you're going to get Alzheimer's, but it's just one thing to keep in the back of one's head.
And then
Just
when you got COVID, then how did that affect you?
I just felt sick. The it did well. I mean, I felt sick, and I had already lost my sense of smell by that time. That was just a couple of years ago that I had COVID. But what it did change was my taste a little bit because most of what we think of as taste is smell. So that was already gone. But it altered the ratio of salt and sour, I think it was. But that just lasted a week or so, and that came back. So that was my COVID.
Another thing found fascinating in the book, and it's related to COVID too, is this face blindness. The face
Oh, yeah.
blindness that you experienced during the pandemic when people were wearing masks. Tell us
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah. So face blindness is actually quite common in Alzheimer's disease because it involves a part of the temporal lobes that is often one of the earliest stages that's affected to Alzheimer's. And, I think something like 2 or 3% of people are born with face blindness. And I had a colleague, though I think I wrote about in that essay in the medical school, who has congenital face blindness, and she couldn't recognize anybody. I mean, she had to wait till somebody spoke until she could figure out who they were. It was really cool. We kind of teased her about it a bit. And Oliver Sacks famously had severe face blindness, and of course, he had a bit of a sense of exaggeration, but he claimed that he couldn't recognize his next door neighbor except when he had his dog, and maybe, but that's a bit extreme.
So did you find that when you were during the age of COVID, when people were wearing masks, did that make it more difficult for you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it did.
Yeah.
But even now, with no masks, I have trouble
Mhm.
recognizing faces, of some neighbors. Yeah, unless they have some very clear distinguishing feature. But um, a blonde-haired woman like you wearing black glasses, there are a lot of those in my
That's right.
neighborhood.
We're all over the place.
And I can't really, help them careful. I have to look at their dog.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another thing that you read about is about the brain fog that
Yeah,
affects Alzheimer's. And
yeah, I mean that we tend to think of, well, your ability to function mentally just is going to get worse and worse, but it staggers, and there are things that can overlie the Alzheimer's that are brief, like having an infection, or being very tired, or having drunk too much alcohol, um, that will have an exaggerated effect on your cognitive ability. And that's been called a brain fog. And there are many causes. In some people, it seems to be associated with abnormal EEG changes. The brain waves are slowed. And whether that's a manifestation or a cause of the fogginess is unclear. But it's a different overlying cognitive problem that people have with Alzheimer's. Now, having said that, the converse is true as well. I find that the time I am clearest thinking is when I'm out exercising, when I'm walking the dog. So, and I'm a big fan of exercise. And I'm 72, and I don't run anymore. I haven't run in decades, but I do walk every day with the dog. We get our 10,000 steps almost every day. Although Jack is getting older. He's got his 10th birthday coming up, and he sometimes lets me know that he's had enough. But we walk up in the hills. Yesterday, we got up there for the first time since the rains let up, and it's still a little muddy, but within half mile of our house, we have trails going through, which I think is the largest urban park in the country, Forest Park in Portland. There are nearly 90 miles of trails in that park. And so there's just a fantastic perk of living in this area. Being able to just walk a couple of blocks and you're in wilderness.
So, and one more thing I wanted to talk about that you wrote about is how you have like lost your sense of fear. You wrote about that about kidnapping in Mombasa,
Kinshasa, yeah.
Kinshasa, and so
Yeah.
you tell us about that story. You were volunteering like to provide medical care there, and
Yeah, well,
it
that
was
was
scary to me.
yeah, well, that's what got my attention was how unscary it was when it should have been so scary. Because especially, given my personal history, I was a very nervous little kid. I remember, the memories that stand out are ones that had an emotional attachment to them. And I was on a long cross-country train trip with one of my sisters and my mother. And the train stopped at some station in the middle of the desert, I don't know where. And everyone wanted to get off and stretch their legs. And I wouldn't go because I was afraid the train would go off and leave me behind. And finally they coaxed me down and I was terrified. And that's not normal, I don't think, for a 5-year-old. But I've always been a little anxious. And I think I got that from my mother. Now I have virtually no anxiety. And that must be the Alzheimer's and one of the perks of it. And in this particular case, I was in the capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'd been invited there to give a series of talks in a international course of neurology. And on a Sunday morning, one of the other faculty members, who was this big guy, really nice guy, a big guy from Gabon, and we'd been told that we shouldn't go out of the hotel without a Congolese person with us for safety, because it's a very dangerous place. And this guy was about 6'4", looked like a football player. And I thought, well, he can guard me. And so we went out, had a walk, and by the government buildings, and we were just about back to the hotel when this car pulled up next to us, and this guy flashed and police ID and wanted to see our passports, and we didn't have our passports, and we said, well, let's go back to the hotel. And they said, no, get in the car. And so it was, none of them were in uniform, and it was unclear whether or not they were police or whether they were just gangsters. And my friend from Gabon was really nervous, and there was actually perspiration on his forehead. And I just thought the whole thing was comical. This guy, the guy who was haranguing us in the front seat, took our wallets and thumbed through them and took all the dollars and euros out, but left the Congolese francs in there. And so they drove us around for a half an hour or so, and then dropped us off on a residential street. And I suggested that we find a police station and report it. And my friend said, no, because if those guys really were police, you really don't want to have the police involved. And so we found out later that they probably were police, that Congo at that time was facing an upcoming presidential election, and things were very stable and at the time, but there was an approaching time when people were going to be losing their jobs if a new regime was in there. So, but there was the lesson for me was that, wow, how did I retain my equanimity in a situation like that? Most people would just be aghast.
I know I would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Wow. So do you have any tips for people on how they can avoid Alzheimer's or try to keep it stable if they have already encountered it?
Yeah. Well, my target audience for the most part are children's generation, because for now, that's where the best ways of controlling Alzheimer's lie is before you actually have it. And that's a hard message to get across, because people in their 50s or 40s are the busiest time of their life. They don't think they have time to get 7 hours of sleep or exercise or eat right. And I'm trying to let people know that, particularly if they have a family history of Alzheimer's disease or another dementia, they can't wait. They don't have to go out and get tested, you know, that unless they want to be in a study. And that would be great if they did. But the things you do to slow the progression of Alzheimer's are the same things that you do to slow the progression of heart disease and stroke risk. So it's a win situation. Interestingly, along that line, I don't think most people realize that ApoE4 is also a strong determinant of cardiovascular disease. So what's good for the heart is good for the brain. Exercise has the best data behind it as being beneficial. And I think people are taking that to heart, so to speak. Diet is a little harder message to get across. The effect of diet is not quite as robust as that of exercise, but it seems unequivocally to be real. And there seems to be you don't have to go all in. Even people who partially follow these what seem to be draconian diets to people who are meat eaters, even people who follow it in part get some benefit. But following a Mediterranean style diet, eating fish, minimum amount of red meat, vegetable based, and there are several variants, like the Mind diet that I follow, adds some more berries and cheese, but they share the minimizing the red meat and going with fish, chicken, vegetables.
I'm hearing a lot more about that. And even just diets like the Mind diet that you mentioned, the Mediterranean diet, but even just things that you can do to lower the inflammation in your body, right? Taking care of your gut health is really important.
Yep.
That's a new one that's coming up. I just went to a day-long seminar about healing your gut and what are you anti-inflammatory eating and practices, and those are all in that realm. And I was just listening to a podcast actually with Daniel Amen, and he was talking about a lot of these things too, and about exercise being really important. So I think what you're saying is so important. It's and I feel you on the you're wanting to talk to people who maybe are too busy to hear what you have to say right now, and they feel sort of invulnerable. And that's always a tricky thing, right? So it's trying to say, maybe you should take a little heads up right now, but this is a tough time of life to hear that. And yet we can be proactive, and there are benefits beyond preventing Alzheimer's. There's, like you said, it's related to the ApoE gene, also is about cardiovascular health. There's so many other things that can get us at different places. It's just about living a healthier life, feeling better every day, right? So you show up, you feel good, you interact with people in a whole different way than if you wake up and you feel achy and tired and lethargic. So yeah, so there's all kinds of good that comes out of it.
I may have already said this, but specifically for exercise, there's both an acute effect. You actually have better cognition while you're exercising. And for me, it lasts about 2 or 3 hours afterwards. And then there's the chronic effect and there are probably different mechanisms. But I find that if I'm stuck on what I'm going to write for my blog post or something, I'll go out and take a walk in the hills with the dog and think about it when I'm on that walk, and where I can hold it together a little bit better than if I'm just sitting in the armchair at home. So it's something you can actually notice. You can notice that benefit. At least I can.
Oh, no, I can too. I would agree with you 100%. I mean, if I'm taking a walk, I come back and I have lots of ideas. It's sometimes I have to get better at writing down some of those great ideas, even during the walk, so I'll use my phone. I'll leave myself a note on my phone. So sometimes it's just getting that clarity. Very cool. Yeah, it's great to know that you're finding that. I know you wanted to read a little bit, so maybe this would be a good time for you to read some for us.
Okay, this is the last chapter, last essay in the new book, and it's called Living in the Moment with Alzheimer's. When we are young, the midline of our lives stretches from our earliest memories to our expectations for the future. As the cognitive impairment of Alzheimer's disease progresses, that timeline begins to constrict. Perhaps surprisingly, the first memories that start to go are the most recent. Where did I put that? You fill in the blank. The consolidation of new memories in the hippocampus is impaired while our ability to remember events from the distant past is relatively well preserved in a variety of cortical regions of the brain. As time goes on and the amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles spread throughout the brain, the distant memories start to fade. The memories most likely to endure are those that were associated with strong emotional content, but eventually even those start to disappear. At the same time, our abilities to look into the future and make plans become impaired as damage spreads to the prefrontal cortex. Eventually, in the late stages of Alzheimer's, we are left with life in the present, no past and no future. I'm not there yet, but I can sense the shrinking timeline of memories from the past and plans for the future. For those of us out on the Alzheimer's journey, it's really important to embrace the moment and not dwell on the frustration of trying to remember the past and plan for the future. Others can help us retrieve old memories. Calendars, lists, and post-it notes will help us minimize the chaos of the future. But happiness and peace come from focusing on the moment, whether it's hugging a grandchild, writing in a journal, working in the garden, or listening to great music. As Horace put it over 2,000 years ago, seize the day and don't worry about tomorrow.
Great advice. That's beautiful.
So tell us again the name of the new book.
The new book is Dispatches from the Land of Alzheimer's.
Oh, fantastic. Beautiful cover. Yeah, very nice.
Do you have the book, The Tattoo on My Brain? Do you have that book,
I
Andy?
don't have it with it downstairs.
No worries.
But I want to make sure everybody knows that you actually had a documentary made by Viacom about you called A Tattoo on My Brain, which you can watch on Paramount Plus. And I watch it, and it is wonderful. It's very moving and informative. And if you're interested in learning more about Alzheimer's, living with Alzheimer's, dementia, or just about Dan, I recommend that you watch it.
Yeah,
That's
thank
fantastic.
you. Yeah, I had very little editorial input on that, so I was a little nervous about what they would do with it, and I think they did a good job. I wanted to make sure my only requirement was that I didn't want doom and gloom, and I think they did that.
No, it shows you being very active and, walking, going to the beach and doing your photography work and with your grandchildren. It was very well done.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important because when people hear Alzheimer's or dementia, we think of the person who's sitting there staring off into space, not interacting, doesn't know anything. I mean, we see this image and it's an image that gets put out there in movies and media, and it's not the whole of it. It's not the whole of it. And it's so important for us to destigmatize and talk about it.
And not only is it not the whole of it, it is a very small percentage of it. And that's what people don't realize, that Alzheimer's is not a disease of a few years. It's a disease of 30 years. And 20 of those years are without symptoms. And there may well be a time within those 20 years where mitigation will really make a difference. And time will tell. But that's what I'm keeping. I'm keeping my fingers crossed, not for me, but for the next generation, and try to prevent this. I think that we're a little bit too too tied into the expectations that have been put on us by the pharmaceutical industry, and that there will be a cure for Alzheimer's. Well, maybe, but we don't have to wait for a cure. We can just do things that really make a significant difference, that are available, they're evidence proven, they're not squirrely, they're real things that are really not controversial anymore. And they don't cost anything. So except maybe
Exactly.
maybe a gym membership.
Wonderful.
Fantastic.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for giving us your time again for The Tattoo on My Brain. And he also was in a panel discussion that we did, I think back in November
Yeah.
2023, called Writing Through the Fog with 2 other authors. So we'll put the show in the show notes, the links to all of those things and to the film, so you can find them. And
Fantastic.
congratulations on the new book, Dan.
Okay. Thanks very much.
It's beautiful. Wonderful to see you. And thank you so much for all that you're offering everyone. It's fantastic. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Untangling Alzheimer's and Dementia, a podcast produced by owlsauthors.com, a community dedicated to supporting caregivers and people with dementia through heartfelt personal stories. Please hit the subscribe button and like buttons, and we'd love to hear your comments. To learn more about Owls Authors, be sure to go to owlsauthors.com and subscribe to our newsletter so you can be among the first to know everything happening at Owls Authors. You can also follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, where we share a wealth of resources for the dementia journey. Remember, you are not alone. One can sing a lonely song, but we chose to form a choir and create harmony. See you soon.